Nowadays, the great and the good, the rich and the powerful, have to be very careful indeed to avoid the glare of the modern media spotlight. It's very difficult for them to misbehave without the entire world finding out.
I did not have sexual relations with that woman.
In the past, those who ruled over us had no such problem. They didn't have to worry about journalists or cameramen who might expose their human frailties, foibles, and sins. They were safe from the headlines and gossip columns. Until now. Now, the modern media is going to have its day as it gets an unexpected opportunity to dig the dirt on some very famous figures from history. It is going to expose the private lives of the kings and queens of England. Queen Victoria, the woman who gave her name to an entire era associated with steadfastness, family strength, high principles, and morals. And John Brown, her Scottish personal attendant and special friend. The man that alienated her family, the man with whom she had a close relationship that scandalized the country. It was a classic case of private behavior not quite matching the public facade. And the Queen got away with it for 18 whole years. Because there was no mass media to scrutinize the relationship, she was able to tell everyone to mind their own business. Maybe Victoria would have had a rougher ride if today's cruel cartoonists had been able to let their imaginations and their pens run riot.
Now that's what I call a caber, Mr. Brown.
I don't think for a second that Queen Victoria would have got away with it for so long with John Brown. And sometimes it makes me think of Charles and Camilla, that they tried and wanted and, were they keeping it under the wraps? There's no way she could have had this affair. And it's interesting to speculate as to whether it would have ended or whether she would have been forced to make an honest man of him. And would we have stomached that? I have no idea. I suspect not. I think that it wouldn't have been allowed to happen. And that clear happiness that they apparently derived from it, they wouldn't have had it. I think we would have had a very, very difficult time with it, and I think it would have been exposed, and I think then ultimately it would have become impossible for them because there would have been no hiding place.
John Brown was a Scottish gillie who was suddenly brought south by the Queen in 1865 to be her permanent personal attendant. Even while the Queen was tut-tutting about her eldest son Albert's colourful private life, the whispers about her relationship with Brown were growing louder and louder.
She first met Brown when he was aged 24. He was a tall, handsome, red-whiskered young man, young groom, and she was 32. He was a part of the entourage up in Scotland, and Prince Albert had strongly, very warmly recommended John Brown to her as her outdoor personal companion. Of course, she obviously obeyed Prince Albert, and it wasn't long before she was making informal conversation with him, and he'd answer back. There developed quite a little rapport, and I think because she was queen and he was only a gillie, there wasn't any thought of any impropriety about it, but certainly she unbent before him in a way that she never did before.
The Queen came to rely on Brown more and more, and in the end the two hardly bothered to hide their special friendship. Cosy walks together in the bracing fresh air. Imagine how that would have gone down with the public had some enterprising snapper sold his picture to the Sunday papers. The hard-drinking, plain-spoken gruff Scot was obviously highly popular with the Queen, but at court He made enemies among those that resented Brown's presence and the influence he had over her. It didn't take long for the gossip mongers to get to work and for the rumours to start flying. Victoria and Brown had secretly married. She had given birth to Brown's child while she was in Switzerland. It was all good stuff that modern-day tabloid editors would have loved to have got their hands on.
I think that we're fascinated by what happened with Queen Victoria and Brown because he was who he was. If we try to speculate about what would happen today, say Prince Philip had died about 15 years ago, leaving the Queen as a good-looking, very fit, middle-aged woman on her own, I think that the media and the world would have absolutely tolerated the idea that she had a companion, a nice man of her own class, obviously titled, has to have been himself a widower. There would be no other way, I think, that he could have acquired that status. I mean, a single man would have been suspect and a divorcee would have been too risque.
It wasn't just the gossips that had it in for Brown. The royal family also despised him.
Queen Victoria bustled about interfering with everybody, and he did too. He wouldn't allow people to visit the Queen or go to see the Queen.
He was obviously quite a complicated guy, and he wasn't someone who liked to stay completely in the shadows, and he liked kind of throwing his weight around a bit. But that was what attracted her, and she wasn't going to be attracted to some small man who was going to sit in the corner and just come and go at her beck and call.
Prince of Wales, Bertie, he loathed Brown so much. Princess Alice once said, he can talk to the Queen about anything, and we, her children, we're restricted into the subjects that we can talk to her about.
John Brown died on the 27th of March, 1883, aged just 56. The heartbroken Queen wrote, "Weep with me, for we have lost the best, the truest heart that ever beat. My grief is unbounded, dreadful, and I know not how to bear it." Queen Victoria lived on for a further 18 years. When she died in 1901, John Brown's enemies in the royal family were finally able to take their revenge on the man they had hated, but who had so captivated their mother. The new king, Edward VII, the Queen's eldest son, arranged for every statue or bust of Brown in the royal residences to be dismantled and destroyed. This was perhaps the first thing Edward had done in his life that hadn't required his mother's permission. For nowadays, Queen Victoria's treatment of her eldest son, she called Bertie, would perhaps have been considered abusive. Not physically, but mentally abusive, because she had carried out a long and unpleasant campaign against her son that would have kept 21st century headline writers very busy. Victoria had always had some fairly interesting relationships with men. One that had already got the tongues of the gossips wagging was with Lord Melbourne, who was the British Prime Minister when Victoria became Queen in 1837. He was 40 years her senior, but he was clearly very fond indeed of the new, young, inexperienced monarch.
Well, hello, my dear.
There was certainly a chemistry between them. They had great affection for each other. He'd lived a pretty rough life in politics, and there was this sweet young girl, and I think he fell in love with her. She, on the other hand, of course, desperately wanted somebody to look after her, and she said he looked at me in such a fatherly way.
Whatever the truth, Lord Melbourne became the central male figure in Victoria's life, until she met and married the love of her life, her cousin Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg. They became man and wife in February 1840, just 3 years after she ascended the throne. At the age of 21, Queen Victoria's life changed forever as she fell deeply, deeply in love with her cultivated and cultured German husband. He awakened feelings in her that until then had been buried by her repressed childhood and teenage years, particularly a strong sexual need. a trait that was common to all the Hanoverian monarchs. The passing of time makes it difficult to imagine Victoria as a sex siren. It doesn't exactly fit with her sombre, popular image.
Over here! Cheers, love.
But luckily, Albert was able to satisfy his lusty queen, who was to bear him no fewer than 9 children over the following 17 years. Albert Edward was the second of these. Born on the 9th of November 1841, it was a difficult and painful delivery for the Queen, who nonetheless seemed delighted with the new arrival, the second in the space of a year. This was the first time a male heir had been born to a reigning sovereign of the House of Hanover, and the Queen and her consort were determined to prepare him for the rigours of kingship as soon as possible. And so, when Edward was only 7, Victoria, Albert, and the tutors got to work. Education, education, education. That was what the boy needed, and that, almost to the exclusion of all else, was exactly what he got.
There was a team of tutors producing the most harsh regimen that you could possibly imagine for this poor young kid. He was given 6 or 7 hours of study every day, 6 days a week, no light reading, harsh physical exercise for the rest of the time. And his tutors were given the specific instructions that he should go to bed physically completely tired every night.
Albert's mother was beginning to show early signs of a positive dislike of her son. She thought he was willful and idle, and so their regime became ever more oppressive and stifling. As he grew older, the young man developed a taste for women, laughter, and fun, but Victoria and Albert were having none of it. They clamped down even harder on the prince, who had come to love the high life. During the summer months of 1861, matters got even worse. Bertie fell head over heels in love with the actress Nellie Clifton.
Well, he was on army manoeuvres in Ireland, and his fellow officers, after a party one night, they managed to smuggle an Irish actress into his tent, Nellie Clifton. Well, I suppose he went into his tent and found this gorgeous creature inside and enjoyed it very much. But of course, they heard about it in London. The reaction of Prince Albert and Victoria was just unspeakable.
A dalliance with a common actress was not at all what the Queen and the Prince Consort had in mind for their son. And when word of the affair reached the ears of Bertie's father, they caused him the greatest pain I have yet felt in my life. Albert's sad words rang around Victoria's head, and it was while visiting Bertie in November 1861 that Albert fell ill. He was never to recover. Prince Albert succumbed to typhoid fever on the 14th of December. The Queen was utterly devastated and heartbroken. But the Queen's grief was worsened by other feelings, those of bitterness, anger, contempt, and disgust for the son she believed had helped bring about the death of her beloved husband. It was nonsense, of course, but Victoria would not be persuaded. Much as I pity him, I never can or shall look at him again without a shudder. She spent the next 40 years taking her revenge.
You'd expect that a young man would take up the reins of government and take on responsibilities after that. But she wrote that Bertie should upon no account be put at the head of any of those societies or commissions or preside at any of those scientific proceedings in which his beloved father took so prominent a part. She deliberately, right from the beginning, specifically excluded him from any responsibility.
So was it any great surprise that, humiliated, denied all access to organised work, the prince retreated to the world of drinking, gambling, hunting, shooting, dancing and revelry with his society chums that Victoria so despised? or that he sought comfort in the arms of mistresses that gave him what his frigid wife would not. Rejection by a man's mother is one thing, but rejection by his mother and his wife? So the next time opportunist politicians speak of a return to Victorian values, perhaps it might be wise to ask what they really mean. Life as a king in medieval England was a difficult business at the best of times. You see, there were so many people after the job. Of course, not everyone could get their hands on the main prize, so there was often an unseemly scramble to win influence over the man that did. All kinds of people tried to win their way into a king's affections. This is Piers Gaveston, and if anyone managed to become friends with a king, he did. Piers was the favourite of Edward II, who came to the English throne in 1307. Not only was he the king's favourite, in fact, he was also his lover.
He was extremely fond of Gaveston to the point of homosexual love. Even at the time, there was a medieval writer who said, "I never knew anyone who loved another man so much as him."
Now, it wasn't an easy thing to be gay during the medieval period in England. Homosexuality was thought to be a heresy, a sin against nature. To practice it was thought to buy a certain ticket to hell.
It was against church teaching. People didn't like it. Bishops spoke against it.
The idea of an openly gay king is probably not quite so startling today.
I think that it would be actually quite possible, because it's not a very difficult stretch of the imagination to imagine us having an openly gay prime minister. And if we can encompass that, then I think you could go forward to an openly gay king. There would be no question of having a camp partner who lauded it around Buckingham Palace, you know, sort of maybe in drag. That I really can't see. But a, so to speak, sober, quiet, long-term, clearly loving relationship would be stomached and would be all right. But my God, it would be interesting.
Being ruled by a gay king was probably alarming enough for England's powerful barons. To make matters worse, they simply hated Piers Gaveston. Gaveston was an extravagant dandy, powdered and perfumed, charming in an oily way, but insufferably bumptious and arrogant. None of this bothered King Edward, though, who seemed to be infatuated with his ambitious best friend. Perhaps a few embarrassing pictures in a modern tabloid paper might have made him just a little more careful.
Gaveston just held the prince absolutely mesmerised. He just gave Gaveston virtually everything. I mean, the most important thing he gave him was the earldom of Cornwall. The Duke of Cornwall is the prerogative of a royal, not a jumped-up bloke like Gaveston. When he had his coronation, who presented the great crown of St Edward? Gaveston. And that just infuriated the barons. They hated him.
Edward had not exactly been popular with his father, Edward I, who was also deeply suspicious of his son's relationship with Gaveston. As a prince, Edward had tried to persuade his father to make a gift of some land to his friend, but the king was so angry at the suggestion that he physically attacked his son and threw him out. Edward I, a warrior king, the Hammer of the Scots, was bitterly disappointed with his son, who also indulged in other pastimes like digging and bricklaying that he considered unsuited to royalty. So unalike were father and son that there were even rumours that Prince Edward was not the fruit of the king's loin. Edward became king in 1307, and he was married the following year to the teenage Isabella of France. Ah, Isabella. Poor, unfortunate Isabella, destined to become one of England's most vilified queens.
Almost every royal marriage in those days, which was an arranged affair, it was political. To begin with, she was just a little 16-year-old. When she married him, she was quite an innocent, sweet young thing, quite unversed into the sort of world that she was being brought into. Edward, I don't think he could care less about a 16-year-old princess he'd never seen, and he himself was 24. There was an 8-year gap.
Perhaps the Queen should have seen the warning signs when Edward insisted that Gaveston be given the honour of carrying the crown and the sword of St Edward at their wedding ceremony. Some court gossips even said that Edward had given Gaveston the royal wedding gifts. He was certainly allowed to organise the wedding feast, which was something of a shambles. The food was terrible and it was served late. Not that Piers was worried. He just blamed everyone else for the fiasco. In 1311, the barons, who were by now thoroughly cheesed off by Gaveston's ever-increasing power and influence, decided that enough was enough. In fact, they raised such a fuss that the king decided it would be best if Gaveston made himself scarce for a while. Together, they decided that Piers should take a little trip abroad. And so, taking his entire household with him, Edward went to the port of Bristol, where he bade his favourite and emotional farewell.
The Queen departs for France.
But he was soon pining for his absent love, without whom he found it impossible to carry on, and Gaveston was swiftly recalled from Ireland to take his place at the king's side. This time, though, the stakes were much higher. Gaveston would have been well advised to stay away from the country. But that wasn't his style. Perhaps he had convinced himself that with the king at his side, he was safe from the wrath of the barons. He was wrong. And so, in late 1309, rumours began to circulate that the king's favourite man was back in England and that he was lying low in the southwest of the country. It was a bad move. The barons, and in particular the Earl of Warwick, weren't in the mood to be defied a second time. Warwick was the fierce nobleman who had been given the pet name of the Hound of Arden by Gaveston.
I'll hound him till the end of his days.
Unfortunately for Gaveston, the bite of this particular hound was every bit as bad as his bark, and he was determined to sink his teeth into his prey. In the year 1312, the hound got his opportunity.
Certainly in the time of Edward II and through lots of history, you have had these very powerful groups of titled barons, dukes, whatever they happened to be. They had enormous amounts of land, they had enormous amounts of money, and their status and their ongoing status in British society was not dependent on government patronage. And they were able to move in and literally remove Gaveston. What's happened in recent years is that that role has been taken by the media. And maybe it is not a coincidence we call them media barons.
The barons were onto them both, and they both fled north. They went to Newcastle, first of all, and it was quite clear that they were going to get caught, so they split up, and Edward went to York, Gaveston went down to Scarborough. Then they caught him. They proceeded to take him down to London.
For the king's hapless favourite, the party was very much over. "Noble Earl, please have mercy on me," he is said to have pleaded to Warwick. But having smelt blood, the Hound of Arden was not about to let go. Gaveston was taken to Blacklow Hill, which lies between the towns of Warwick and Kenilworth in the Midlands of England, and without ceremony or mercy, he was beheaded. Many other earls of the kingdom trooped out to Blacklow Hill to witness the execution, perhaps to satisfy themselves that Gaveston was really dead. There'd have been no need for such drastic action. The press would have done for Gaveston long before the axe was needed. Or would they?
The modern media would clearly, I think, have destroyed Gaveston from what we know about his behaviour, because A, he was very in your face, very camp, and he was also extremely arrogant in a way that I don't think any female partner would be, in terms of, he was male, he therefore felt he had power and he flexed his muscles.
It was said that Edward grieved for Piers like a father grieves for his son. But favourites come and favourites go, and Edward was soon being comforted by another attractive male companion. His name was Hugh Despenser. Hugh was a young courtier who, if not quite so dashing as Piers Gaveston, was certainly every bit as ambitious. And he was about to make himself just as unpopular.
Hugh dispenses his favours far and wide.
Working alongside his father, who was also called Hugh, the young Despenser slipped effortlessly into Piers Gaveston's shoes.
They were very staunchly loyal to Edward right the way through the first part of his reign. The elder Despenser was an honourable man, though very greedy and acquisitive, but the younger man was exactly the same age as Edward II himself. When Gaveston went, he sort of took over his role. He made the younger one Chamberlain, and he remained Chamberlain for almost 20 years, and he did a lot of good to the country. He also did a lot of good to himself.
But those wishing to lead a long and carefree life were well advised to avoid the position of King Edward's favourite. The knives were soon out for the Despensers, and the younger Hugh in particular. Things really started to go wrong for the Despensers in 1316. That was the year Edward finally recognised he really wasn't making a very good job of running the country, and decided to hand over control to the barons. This was not good news for the two Hughs, who, just like Gaveston before them, were now on a collision course with the powerful nobleman. And they had another big problem. The Queen also hated the Despensers. Perhaps not quite as much as she hated the husband who had ignored, disgraced, humbled, and humiliated her, but she hated them just the same.
There was a diplomatic problem with France. She was the wife of Edward, and she was the sister of the King of France. So the Pope thought that she was the perfect person to intercede between the two. She was very cunning. She was no longer the sweet 16-year-old that we came across a bit earlier. She had learnt a lot in those years. When she got to France, it was quite clear that she'd gathered around herself a lot of supporters. In particular, the one that she had her eye on was Roger Mortimer. and she engineered Mortimer's escape from the tower. He shinned down a rope from the tower, made his way to France, and there they lived in open adultery.
I feel that marriage is a bond between a man and a woman, and that someone has come between my husband and myself to break this bond. I will not return until this intruder is removed, and shall assume the robes of widowhood until I can be avenged. There were no prizes for guessing which intruder the Queen had in mind, and so Isabella plotted her revenge. It was not long in coming. In September 1326, she landed in England with a few hundred supporters and, crucially, at her side, her eldest son, the 13-year-old Prince Edward, the future Edward III.
Edward was completely panic-stricken and tried to escape, but she was winning the day. And the townsfolk of London, that is, the citizens of London, were very much on her side.
For the Despensers, just like Gaveston 14 years earlier, the end was nigh. Hugh the Elder had the easier time of it. They hanged him on Common Gallows at Bristol, before chopping him into bits. But they had reserved something special for the younger Hugh. He was first taken to Hereford, near his estates in the Welsh marches, dressed in sackcloth and ashes. He was mocked and vilified by crowds in each town he passed through. After a short mock trial, he was hoisted up a ladder where his genitals were cut off and flung into a fire, as punishment for the unnatural acts he had supposedly committed with King Edward.
He was brutally dispensed with.
But the Queen wasn't finished yet. There was still the question of the final revenge on her wretched husband. First, Edward II was deposed and his son was crowned King Edward III on the 29th of January 1327. It was the first time in English history that a queen and her son had displaced the ruling monarch. For the next 3 weeks, the ex-king was shunted about from castle to castle. The truth was that no one was really certain what to do with him. That was until the night of the 20th of February at Berkeley Castle. Perhaps it is best to let the chronicler Holinshead describe what happened there. With a heavy table or a door cast upon him, they kept him down, and into his fundament put a horn. And through the same they thrust up into his body a white-hot spit, which passing up into his entrails and being rolled to and fro, burnt the same. But no appearance of any wound outwardly could be perceived. It was said that the screams of the dying king could be heard in the nearby town. Queen Isabella had at last taken her terrible revenge. If the modern popular press had had to find words to describe King George IV, they would probably have included colourful and hellraiser. He was a drinker, a glutton, a drug addict, a womanizer, a fantasist, not to mention his self-indulgence, his unique ability to run up debts, and to drop his friends and political allies whenever it suited him. Born in August 1762, the first child of King George III and Queen Charlotte, George was a very handsome chap, with striking blue eyes and a clear, healthy complexion.
Over here, over here.
Ah yes, young George was a very popular young prince indeed, and great things were expected of him, not only by the doyens of the Georgian court, but also by the people of the country.
He was a cultivated young man, very moral, and I think they looked forward to expansion. I mean, we were, at that time, developing our empire, and America was still a part of the British Empire at that time, or colonies, and so everything looked rosy.
But it wasn't long before those infamous Hanoverian hormones kicked in. George had led a fairly sheltered life, but as he began to move more freely in society circles, he began to notice women. And young George liked what he saw. The first object of his desires was a well-known actress called Mary Robinson, who was, by all accounts, a beguiling beauty. Court rumour had it that the smitten George had declared his never-ending love for her. Never-ending, that is, until other young ladies blessed with the same ample proportions he so favoured might happen along. And there was no doubt about it. George was very attractive to ladies, an absolute gift for today's cartoonists.
My dear, how lovely to meet you both.
George's extravagance and womanizing placed a further strain on his already difficult relationship with his father. By contrast, King George III was a prudent family man who found the behaviour of his son simply intolerable.
They were two totally different characters. As I said, George III was very moral, very upright, very quiet, and very domesticated. Prinny, very intelligent, very articulate, very artistic, very exhibitionist, and I think that he simply burst out of the bounds that his father wanted to put round him. They wanted the best for him, and they were all the time trying to force him to be good.
By now, the prince was heavily in debt. But his affairs seemed to be about to right themselves when, in 1783, he was set up in the splendour of Carlton House in London, with an allowance of £50,000 per annum from his father. He was also granted a payment of £30,000 by Parliament to clear his debts. But George couldn't resist the temptation to do the old place up, and before he knew it, the cost of all the refurbishments and building work had spiralled and got out of control, and he was in debt again. Serious debt. This time, to the tune of £250,000. But he was in love once more, this time with an older woman, Maria Fitzherbert. This time, though, there were unwelcome complications for the romance.
She was a commoner. Now, I know that means almost nothing to us today, but right up to into the 20th century, kings married princesses. But it was worse than that, because there was the Royal Marriage Act of 1772, and that would invalidate any marriage that he might make if he married someone under the age of 25, and that he was still under 25. It was even worse than that, because she was a Catholic. Now, the Act of Settlement in 1701 made it impossible for any prince who married a papist to succeed to the throne. And poor Maria Fitzherbert was a papist. Also, she was quite a moral young lady, and she would not be his mistress.
However, George was not a man to be deterred by such piffling matters, so he married Maria anyway. But he did it in secret. He even bribed a Church of England minister to officiate. Just imagine what price a few secretly taken paparazzi pictures would have fetched today. Before long, rumours of the marriage were rife at court and in London society, which the prince flatly denied. They were, he said indignantly, base and scandalous. He neglected to mention they were also true. The prince tried to raise funds to clear the debt on Carlton House, but to no avail, and his father refused point blank to dip into his pocket once more to bail out his spendthrift son. Before long, the prince was being pursued by creditors.
For a change, the prince is being chased.
There was nothing for it but to downsize. Racehorses were sold, the size of his household drastically reduced, but most of all there was a good, healthy dollop of contrition coupled with a public pledge to retire from public life until his debts were repaid in full. Parliament was impressed. Impressed enough to grant another £160,000 to help George become solvent once again. His father even softened, adding £10,000 to the prince's annual allowance. So, a prince that told lies to Parliament and was given public money to shore up his rickety finances, the modern headline writers would hardly have been able to contain themselves. And George's response to this parliamentary and paternal largesse? More spending and extravagance, this time on the construction of the magnificent pavilion at Brighton. It still stands today, a spectacular testimony to George's immaculate good taste, great artistic gifts, and a reminder of his unrivaled genius for spending money. Against the backdrop of the turmoil of his love life, Maria Fitzherbert had now been cast aside, and of his father's first bout of madness, George was forced to contemplate a proper dynastic match to a European princess. Not least because it was the only way to get Parliament to agree to once again pay off his huge debts. The lucky girl chosen to be the prince's bride was his 27-year-old cousin, Princess Caroline of Brunswick. It is difficult to imagine a woman less suited to the fastidious George. Caroline was a large, unladylike figure who placed personal hygiene very low on her list of priorities, only a place or two above her personal appearance, in fact, about which she seemed not to care at all. The first meeting between the prince and his intended was little short of calamitous. The prince took one look at her and turned tail, saying to an aide, "I am not well. Pray bring me a glass of brandy." For her part, Caroline thought the prince was fat and nowhere near as handsome as his portraits, and so the scene was set for one of royal history's most unhappy marriages. The couple were joined together on the 7th of April, 1795. George got spectacularly drunk at the wedding feast and spent most of the wedding night lying in the grate, although he did manage to rouse himself to consummate the marriage at some point. It was the one and only time that he and his wife shared a bed as man and wife.
They just couldn't stand each other. I mean, really, they could not. And after the first wedding night, they sort of agreed to separate. Although she had a daughter, he didn't have any truck with her, really. Caroline went off and lived in Hampstead and really lived it up. And then she took a lover and went off to Italy. She danced topless.
Meanwhile, Maria Fitzherbert was back on the scene, and back in George's bed. So the princess obviously decided that she was not going to hide away either.
he was posed, I think, with a problem, because there was Caroline behaving grotesquely, and he forbade anybody to pray for her in the churches, speak of her.
By 1811, King George III, whose life had been clouded by periodic bouts of insanity, was judged to be incapable of carrying out his duties, and in February of that year, Prince George was proclaimed Prince Regent. And perhaps, against all expectations, he didn't do a bad job.
Look around London. He transformed it. Regent's Park, Regent Street. He also patronised artists, writers, Jane Austen, Buckingham Palace. He had the devil's own job to get the money to do that, but he pushed it through. He was an egomaniac.
George III died on the 29th of January 1820, and at the age of 58, the Prince Regent ascended the throne as King George IV. One of his first acts as king was to work out how to dissolve his disastrous marriage and prevent Caroline becoming queen.
Meanwhile, Caroline knew that she was queen, and she asked the Prime Minister, "What arrangements are there in Westminster Abbey for my coronation?" And she came back, and every place that she stopped at, from the coast right up to London, people cheered her, bunting out for her, bands playing, and poor old Prinny was absolutely terrified of having her.
There now followed, perhaps, the most cruel episode of George's reign. The lavish coronation ceremony took place on July the 19th, 1821, but with one notable absentee. On the express orders of the King, and despite her pitiful attempts to gain entry to Westminster Abbey, Caroline was denied the right to attend or take part in the ceremony.
He was inside, and Caroline came swirling up to Westminster Abbey, having the doors closed against her everywhere she went.
Perhaps there are echoes in Caroline's story of Diana, Princess of Wales, another high-profile queen-in-waiting who stole the hearts of the British public more than 250 years later.
You look back on what happened to Caroline of Brunswick and you think, oh my God, of course that couldn't happen today. And then you think, well, actually, hold on a minute. It sort of did. Okay, it wasn't as dramatic. We didn't have a queen being locked out of her own coronation and banging on the door. But we did have a future queen, an HRH, a mother of the future king, being stripped of her titles, being semi-exiled from the life of the royal family, and she was not included in the royal occasion. So she was, in a sense, a pariah. Don't forget that the end result was that Princess Diana ended up going out with the son of a grocer, admittedly a jolly posh grocer and a very rich one, but nevertheless a grocer.
The Emperor Napoleon, Britain's implacable enemy, died on the 5th of May, 1821. An excited courtier was dispatched to take the great news to the king. "My lord, I congratulate you. Your greatest enemy is dead." "Is she, by God?" replied the delighted king. George clearly thought that the courtier had been referring to the Queen. Despite that disappointment, George only had to wait another 3 months for better news. Caroline finally did the decent thing and expired on the 7th of August.
Poor woman, she knew she was dying, and she wanted on the coffin, she wanted a plaque to be put, "Caroline, the injured queen." King George IV, he ordered that should be taken off. And partisans stuck it back on again. And all the way to the coast, whether it was on or off, you never knew.
The public certainly at the time sided with Caroline of Brunswick. I mean, we as a nation like to side with the underdog. Caroline of Brunswick, poor thing, unfortunately, unlike Diana, was not also beautiful and photogenic. But if nobody's in any doubt as to who the public preferred.
Fortified by a copious intake of brandy and wine, and further propped up by the drug laudanum, King George's final years saw him retreat to a world where fact and fantasy were one and the same. The decline in the king's mental and physical health continued until June 1830, when it failed completely, and he died. He passed away unloved by a people who had tired of a monarch, who had enjoyed life a little too much, and who could resist everything but temptation. A man who was concerned for his reputation and for his place in history, but was unwilling to earn either. Although history was to prove him factually incorrect, the writer William Savage Landor probably summed up the feelings of the entire nation when he wrote, "When from the earth the fourth descended, God be praised, the Georges ended."